"You're married now," my father said into the microphone, his voice carrying across the ballroom. "You belong to another family. Don't come back. Disappear from this family forever." For a second, I thought I had misunderstood him. My husband's hand tightened around mine. My mother stared down at the tablecloth. My brother suddenly became fascinated with the floor. Nobody laughed. My father, Richard Lyne, looked directly at me as if he had just announced something perfectly reasonable at my own wedding reception. Then he handed the microphone back to the DJ and sat down. I could feel dozens of people watching me, waiting for tears, an argument, anything. Instead, I lifted my glass. "Thank you all for celebrating with us tonight." My voice didn't shake. That seemed to bother my father more than anger would have. I took my husband's hand and walked out of the ballroom. What Richard didn't understand was that, when he told me to disappear from the family, he had just changed our relationship in a way that reached far beyond a wedding speech. And by the next morning, he would understand exactly how far. In the car, my husband waited until we were several blocks away before asking, "Grace, was he serious?" I stared through the window at the city lights sliding past us. He never says anything he doesn't mean. That was the part outsiders never understood about my father. Richard didn't explode and apologize later. He made declarations. He expected everyone around him to rearrange their lives accordingly. For years, I had done exactly that. Not this time. I barely slept. At sunrise, I opened my laptop and pulled up documents I hadn't looked at closely in years. Then I called my attorney's office. "I need to start a sale." There was a pause. "The apartment." "Yes." "And the account connected to it." "Freeze it." By noon, the apartment was officially listed. Every automatic property payment had been redirected, and the joint account my father had helped manage was locked against further activity until everything could be reviewed. I didn't call him. I didn't send a message. I simply followed the instruction he had given me in front of everyone. Disappear. 3 hours later, my phone started vibrating. Once. Twice. Then nonstop. "Dad. Dad. Dad." I let every call go unanswered. By the time I checked, there were 23 missed calls and 4 voicemails. I opened the newest one. My father wasn't calm anymore. "You had no right to touch my apartment." I stared at the screen. Because there was one problem with that sentence. The apartment had never been his. I played the voicemail twice. "You had no right to touch my apartment." The word asterisk, my asterisk, stayed with me. My husband looked over from the kitchen. "Is his name on the deed?" "No." "Are you sure?" I stood, walked to the filing cabinet, and pulled out the folder containing the original purchase documents. I had bought the apartment years earlier while I was still in law school, using my savings, a loan, and every spare dollar I could protect from tuition and living expenses. I placed the deed on the table. Only one name was printed under owner. Grace Lyne. My husband read it, then looked at me. "So why does he think it belongs to him?" I knew the answer, but admitting it felt different. Because I had let him act like it did. When I first bought the place, Dad had offered to help manage the property. "You're studying law," he had told me. "You don't have time to chase tenants and track expenses. Let me handle the money." At the time, it sounded generous. We opened a joint account strictly for rent deposits, maintenance costs, taxes, and building expenses. Slowly, however, his language changed. My apartment became our property. My tenants became our tenants. Whenever relatives talked about investments, Dad would say, "I taught Grace everything she knows." And when I corrected him, even gently, he would go cold for days. So eventually, I stopped correcting him. That afternoon, my mother called. Her voice was unusually quiet. "Grace, can you undo what you did?" "Which part?" "The account, The sale, all of it. Your father is very angry. I leaned against the counter. Mom, yesterday he told me to disappear from the family forever. Silence. He said it in front of everyone. More silence. Then she whispered, you know how your father gets. No, I know exactly what he said. She exhaled shakily. Please, Grace, just fix this before it becomes worse. I looked down at the deed, still sitting on the table. Why does freezing an account for my apartment make him this afraid? My mother didn't answer. And suddenly, for the first time, I stopped wondering whether Dad was angry about losing control of me. I started wondering what, exactly, he had been doing with something that legally belonged to me. The next morning, my real estate agent called before I had even finished breakfast. Grace, you should come to the apartment building. Why? There's a situation. 20 minutes later, my husband and I pulled into the parking lot. Before I even stepped out of the car, I could hear my father's voice. She's selling the family building without telling anyone, Richard shouted. After everything I sacrificed for her. Several tenants stood near the entrance, looking confused. A few relatives had already gathered after apparently receiving frantic phone calls from my father. The moment Richard saw me, he pointed in my direction. There she is. Every head turned. You're finally here, he said loudly. Tell everyone why you're stealing property that belongs to this family. I didn't raise my voice. Instead, I walked calmly toward the real estate agent waiting beside the entrance. Good morning. She nodded professionally. Good morning, Ms. Line. Richard scoffed. Don't play these games. Tell her she can't sell this building. The agent looked at him politely. Sir, every instruction we've received has come directly from the registered owner. Richard folded his arms. I'm her father. I understand. She can't make this decision without me. The agent maintained the same calm expression. Parenthood does not determine property ownership. The words landed harder than anyone expected. One of my cousins slowly looked from my father to me. What does she mean? I reached into my folder and removed a certified copy of the deed. I bought this apartment years ago. Richard immediately interrupted. I managed it. Yes, I replied, you managed it. That makes it family property. No, I answered. It makes you the person I trusted to help manage expenses. The distinction hung in the air. Several relatives exchanged uneasy glances. One of the tenants quietly asked the agent, so, she really owns the building? Yes. Completely. Yes. Richard's face reddened. You're embarrassing your own father. I met his eyes. You embarrassed me in front of 200 wedding guests yesterday. He opened his mouth but couldn't answer. Instead, he abruptly changed the subject. What about the account? The question caught my attention immediately. Not the apartment. Not the sale. The account. Has she frozen it already? He demanded. No one else seemed to notice how quickly he'd shifted focus. But I did. Yes, I answered. For the first time that morning, genuine panic flashed across his face. How long ago? Yesterday. His breathing changed. He stepped toward me before stopping himself. You had no business doing that. The account exists for apartment expenses. You don't know what you've done. I studied him carefully. He wasn't worried about losing a building. He was worried about losing access to something else. I slipped the deed back into my folder. The paperwork speaks louder than family titles. Several relatives who had defended my father only minutes earlier fell completely silent. Even my brother looked uncertain. Richard stared at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, You've just destroyed something you don't even understand. My phone rang just after 9 the next morning. Ms. Line, the bank representative asked. We need to verify several transactions that failed after the account was frozen. I sat up straighter. What kind of transactions? There were multiple withdrawal attempts that could not be processed. Because you requested a freeze, we need your authorization before releasing any additional information. I authorize a full review. Very well. Our investigations department will contact you today. As soon as the call ended, another one came through. This time, it was the escrow officer handling the apartment sale. Everything is moving on schedule, she said. The buyer has completed the initial review. We'll need a few additional signatures before closing. Thank you, I replied. For the first time since my wedding, I felt something other than humiliation. Things were moving forward. Not emotionally. Legally. By early afternoon, I was sitting across from my attorney with years of account statements spread across the conference table. He adjusted his glasses as he highlighted several transactions. Grace, when this account was opened, its purpose was straightforward. Rent deposits, maintenance invoices, taxes, insurance, and repairs. I know. He slid another statement toward me. About 3 years ago, that changed. I studied the highlighted entries. Payments had begun leaving the account on fixed dates every month. None of the recipients were contractors. None matched property expenses. These weren't here before, I said quietly. They weren't, my attorney replied. Someone gradually added recurring payments that had nothing to do with maintaining the apartment. I looked at him. Without telling me. He nodded. The account evolved beyond its original purpose. A cold realization settled over me. Every month, while I believed the account existed solely for the building, money had quietly been flowing elsewhere. Not in dramatic amounts. Just enough that I never questioned it. Until now. My attorney leaned back. None of these payments appear illegal by themselves, but they certainly aren't consistent with the account's stated purpose. So freezing it stopped all of them. Immediately. Later that afternoon, my younger brother called. His voice lacked its usual confidence. Grace, can we talk? Of course. I honestly thought Dad owned the apartment. So did everyone else. I never asked. Neither had I for a long time. He sighed heavily. He keeps telling everyone different stories. First, he said you stole family property. Then he said the bank made a mistake. Now he's saying the sale isn't legal. I closed my eyes. Because none of those explanations are true. I think I'm starting to realize that. For years, my brother had accepted whatever our father said without question. Now, for the first time, he was questioning him. The next morning, my real estate agent called with good news. We received a strong offer. How strong? She named the figure. It exceeded our asking price. I smiled for the first time all week. Accept it. Within hours, the purchase agreement was signed. The closing date was officially scheduled. Word spread quickly through the family. By evening, Richard appeared at my attorney's office demanding the sale be stopped. He argued. He threatened. He insisted the property belonged to the family. My attorney calmly requested one document. A deed showing your ownership. Richard couldn't produce one. Because none existed. For the first time in my life, my father encountered something he couldn't overpower with confidence or volume. The law didn't recognize titles like asterisk head of the family. It recognized ownership. And the owner was me. The following afternoon, I met my attorney to finalize the remaining paperwork. He walked into the conference room carrying a thick financial report instead of the sale documents. He placed it carefully in front of me. You need to see what was happening inside that account. My attorney opened the report and turned it toward me. Grace, we traced every recurring payment that left the joint account over the past several years. I took a slow breath. What did you find? He tapped the first page. The account started exactly as you intended. Rent came in. Property taxes, insurance, maintenance, and repairs went out. He flipped to the next section. Then, little by little, additional recurring payments were added. I followed the highlighted entries. Every one of them had been scheduled automatically. They weren't for the apartment, I said. No. They weren't for repairs. No. He nodded. They were supporting obligations completely unrelated to this property. I leaned back in my chair. So when I froze the account, every one of those payments stopped immediately. I finally understood why my father had panicked the moment I froze the account. It had never been about losing me. It hadn't even been about losing the apartment. He had built financial routines around an account that existed only because I trusted him. The moment he publicly cut me out of the family, there was no reasonable or responsible way for me to remain financially tied to him. Keeping that arrangement active would have exposed both me and my husband to obligations that had nothing to do with us. Selling the apartment permanently ended that risk. For the first time since my wedding, I didn't feel guilty. I felt certain. A week later, the sale closed without a single legal obstacle. The proceeds were wired directly into an account that belonged solely to me. The joint account was permanently closed. Every remaining property obligation was settled. Everything ended exactly as the paperwork required. The news spread through my family faster than I expected. Several relatives called to apologize. "I honestly thought your father owned the building," one aunt admitted. "So did I," another cousin confessed. When they learned I had purchased the apartment years earlier with my own money, and that Dad had only been helping manage it, their entire view of what had happened changed. His dramatic speech at my wedding no longer looked like authority. It looked like control. My brother visited me a few days later. He stood awkwardly at my front door. "I owe you an apology." "You don't owe me anything." I believed him because I never questioned him. I smiled sadly. "Most of us didn't." He looked down. "I don't think I really understood how much pressure you lived under." "You weren't supposed to. Dad made sure of that." For the first time in years, we talked as brother and sister instead of children trying to predict our father's moods. It felt strangely peaceful. My mother eventually came by as well. She sat quietly across from me for several minutes before speaking. "I knew you paid for that apartment." I looked at her. "I also knew your father liked people believing otherwise. Why didn't you ever say anything?" She lowered her eyes. "Because every time someone challenged him, the house became unbearable." I wasn't angry. I was simply tired. I spent years trying to keep the peace. She nodded. "I know. But peace built on silence isn't really peace." She couldn't disagree. Months later, my husband and I signed the papers on a new home. This time there were no shared accounts. No unnecessary financial entanglements. Every document reflected exactly what it should. Our names. Our decisions. Our future. The house wasn't just a new place to live. It was proof that our marriage had begun with independence instead of control. Richard never recovered the influence he once held over me. Without access to the apartment or the account, he could no longer use either as leverage. Among our relatives, the story gradually changed. People stopped repeating that I had turned against my father. Instead, they quietly acknowledged that he had rejected his daughter while expecting to continue benefiting from her success. One afternoon, nearly 6 months after the wedding, my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Dad. "Can we talk about the misunderstanding?" I stared at the screen for a long moment. Then I remembered him standing in the reception hall, smiling as he told me to disappear from the family forever. There had been no misunderstanding. There had been a choice. His. I deleted the message without replying. Not because I hated him, because I finally understood that protecting my peace did not require explaining my boundaries. As I set my phone down, my husband walked into the room carrying 2 mugs of coffee. Everything okay? I smiled. For the first time in a long time. I looked around the home we had built together. It really is. Richard told me to disappear from the family forever. I simply disappeared from the finances first, and that changed both our lives forever.